6 minutes past 10, the Clement Manyathela show. Tshidi Madia in for Clement. Welcome to the second hour of the show. That condition I was trying to name earlier on, somebody just mentioned it with Uncle Ruckus when I was speaking about Gates McKenzie, is reverse vertigo. That's what he would say, yes. And that's what the minister's being accused of. But anyway, it's a different conversation. We move on. Um, I want us to talk about the national dialogue. It's been such a mess. The dialoguers themselves now clearly need to have a dialogue of sorts. I think attempts to mediate haven't worked out. There's been so much back and forth. And if you've watched the weekend reports, Lizeka Tandwa, Khotatso Madisha doing a really great job in the Sunday Times of speaking about what they believe are the big personalities behind the clash around the dialogue. Of course, that being the former president, Thabo Mbeki, and President Ramaphosa. But the foundations have pulled out and it gave us a myriad of reasons why. And at the heart of it, there's issues around funding that were mentioned, logistics issues that were mentioned. So that's the conversation we're going to have for the next 30 minutes. You've got questions, you've got comments, you want to weigh in on this. Remember, the National Dialogue, the first part of it, the convention, is meant to kick off this week. You can call in 011 883 0702 072 702 1702 if you want to weigh in. But let's talk about that dialogue.
Join us.
Let's walk the talk.
This is 702.
As I said, President Ramaphosa says the organizing team for the National Dialogue has been restructured following the withdrawal of several legacy foundations. Last week, several foundations, including the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the Steve Biko Foundation, Chief Albert Luthuli, Oliver and Adelaide Tambo, F.W. de Klerk, as well as the Archbishop Desmond and Leah Tutu Trust withdrew from the National Dialogue. They spoke about the issue of budget, insufficient time as far as conditions, and even the fact that for them this was meant to be a citizen-led initiative and it was losing that. Last week I spoke about the turf war around control that seems to have been unfolding. And so we are joined now by Lindiwe Gadd, who's a member of the Chief Albert Luthuli Foundation. Lindiwe was also part of that preparatory task team that was meant to be assisting with the convention. As I said, they have pulled out. Lindiwe, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Very much for giving us this opportunity.
I mean, you and I have kind of spoken a little bit last night, but for the listeners' sake, let's go back to the decision to withdraw. We had understood that the preparations were well underway. We saw an open letter even from former President Thabo Mbeki to John Steenhuisen about the DA's decision not to participate. And that open letter suggested that all was well underway. The preparations are in place. This dialogue is important. It's going to happen. And then suddenly, days really leading up to the first convention, the foundations pull out. Let's speak about the reason why the foundations felt uncomfortable continuing with the first convention.
Thank you very much. I think we need to just go back to the principles that civil society had looked at when we looked at this idea of a national dialogue. And at the center of the principles was the idea that this should be a citizen-led process. And that means that both in form and in substance, citizens should be at the forefront of this endeavor. The national dialogue is a process which is 12 months, that will take 12 months. It will involve 13,500 ward-based dialogues, about 50,000 citizen-led dialogues, and about 2.5 to 3 million citizens' engagements using various online platforms. When we say that the national dialogue should be citizen-led, that is both in terms of the planning and the implementation of this endeavor. And it was therefore decided that the best platform to do the day-to-day implementation of the national dialogue would be via NEDLAC, which is a nexus between government, labor, business, and civil society. Unfortunately, what came to pass was that with the budget only having been transferred last week on Tuesday, and given that the convention is taking place this Friday, NEDLAC itself was unable to capacitate itself to really manage an endeavor of this magnitude. And as a result, the involvement of government became increasingly evident. various structures were set up in government, which were really now running the day-to-day activities towards the first national convention. Secondly, with the budget having only been received on Tuesday last week, as I've already said, we are concerned that the procurement processes for the first convention, which would involve 1,000 delegates coming from around 30 sectors, would potentially be compromised in terms of the PFMA. We had raised this particular flag at the inaugural meeting of the Eminent Persons Group, which took place early in July. We've raised it subsequently in multiple meetings of the preparatory task team where government representatives had been present. And eventually we raised it as well in a meeting with the president last week. So we felt that whilst we were, at the engine of this, increasingly government was involved in the planning and implementation, and that parallel structures that were not really giving us the answers that we required about how is this still a citizen-led initiative and how is the procurement happening such that it could be compliant.
The argument that some had put forward in government, and obviously I'm now quoting unnamed sources, was an argument that this is public good. This is a public good. It's public money. That wanting government to step aside with public funds isn't the right approach. That's what people had said to me. And some had even taken an attitude to say, but these are 5 families, private organizations, wanting to dictate what must happen with public money. That for me almost felt acrimonious in approach. And I don't know if that is what the feeling was at the table, that there is a trust deficit, even about the motive, even about every step of the planning and what is required. And in the trust deficit, then what you find is belligerence at every turn with everything that is needed. And that's kind of also how we got to where we were. I don't know if that's how you experienced it on your end.
Look, I don't want to go into an acrimonious debate about what so-and-so said and what so-and-so said. What we had said in terms of the oversight of the funding is that the funding should go to NEDLAC. If you look at the annual reports of NEDLAC over the past 5 years, they have been one of the seminal semi-government organizations which have actually had clean audits for 5 years running. And therefore, we had every confidence that in the hands of NEDLAC, those funds would be used in line with the PFMA. The difficulties started to arise when we, as the civil society groupings, some of the civil society groupings within the preparatory task team, started asking questions to say, how can we be a few weeks away from the first convention, and yet we have no understanding of how these procurement processes within government are taking place in line with the PFMA. Mm. And it's important that an endeavor like the National Convention, which is trying to cure some of the ills, including the use of public funds, should actually be able to have, to be allowed to ask questions and to get clear answers as to what are the procurement processes for a process such as this. If you can imagine, if you have a national convention with 1,000 delegates, it would be very difficult to imagine that you can have not a single item of procurement that is over R1 million. And in terms of the PFMA, it says any procurement over R1 million requires a 21-day advertising period to allow for fairness in the process. Now, if the funding only came through on Tuesday last week, I think any person, any rational person would want to ask the question, how can you do PFMA compliant procurement in such a short period of time? As I speak to you today, I still cannot give you an answer to that.
Do you think government was genuine in its participation in the dialogue? Do you think that genuine governments coming out to the public saying, let's get behind this initiative, let's have South Africans talking, do you think it authentically, genuinely believed in the cause and was applying itself to what was being done, wanting to legitimately have this do what the foundations wanted it to produce?
We started engaging with emissaries of the president as early as September or October last year. And we had been working very well together, cooperatively, in a spirit of collegialism. The issues only arose really when we started asking questions about these procurement issues, when we started experiencing the planning structures and the implementation structures, where suddenly, as civil society, we became the smallest component of those structures, which again begs the question: is this really a civil society-led initiative? But at the same time, we had many statements coming from the president himself, as well as in the court case with the Labour Party, where he gave his commitment that this, whilst being funded by government, should not be government-driven or government-controlled. So we can only take the president at his word, and so I cannot comment beyond that.
And lastly, just before I let you go, you and I've had this conversation briefly when I interviewed you for news last night, that some of the claims around the issue of the money, the foundation says it's about the logistics, about the procurement, it's about putting together this project, bringing this project to life. But some of your counterparts in government have said these are foundations that need to keep people at work. These are foundations that are cash strapped and are eyeing this project as a way to continue existing and keeping themselves at work. These are foundations that we hardly hear of, that don't contribute as much to society, except for they come back annually to celebrate their patrons' anniversaries and the likes. That attitude and those kind of claims being leveled against the foundations, the motive of the foundations being questioned like that. Please, can you just respond to that?
I think it's very unfortunate that in disagreeing and having disagreements around these issues, that it can degenerate into accusations such as those. I don't want to get involved in a spat between ourselves and colleagues who are anonymous on the other side. What I can tell you is that when the call was made by President Thabo Mbeki last year, he called the foundations and said, "Are you willing to be part of such an endeavor?" And we are all experiencing the challenges that South Africans experience on a day-to-day basis, where many things in our country are broken, where many of the hopes that we had for freedom and democracy have not become the lived reality of South Africans on the ground. We still have South Africans who lack water. We still have children going to schools where there are more students than a teacher can actually teach. We still have a massive issue of joblessness in this country. There are many, many problems. We don't have an economic plan where you can say, yes, this plan is going to take us forward to address joblessness, to address the challenges that entrepreneurs in this country have. And so that is what the national dialogue is about. It is not about individuals. And I'm sure that this national dialogue, with citizens getting involved, I hope, and it is our hope as the foundation, that it will continue to live up to its promise. And it is, again, if I could just say, this is about dialogue, South Africans talking to South Africans. And in talking, we need to be agreeable. We need to listen to each other respectfully, and we need to talk to each other respectfully. And so it is very disappointing that when discussing issues of principle, the matters can then degenerate into accusations against foundations or individuals and the such. That is not the spirit in which this national dialogue should take place. And I would really urge all parties to actually continue to deal with these matters in a manner that is respectful and that really takes at heart the interests of South Africans.
All right, thank you so much. That's Lindiwe Gadd, who's the former deputy chair of the National Dialogue's Preparatory Task Team. She also speaks, of course, on behalf of the Chief Albert Luthuli Foundation. I'm not surprised by how this has played out, despite, of course, that letter by former President Thabo Mbeki to John Steenhuisen that all was well and they're well on their way to this massive dialogue for South Africans. I also see on the TV that a media briefing about the dialogue is currently underway. They're discussing preparations, what's expected to happen. Remember, the first convention takes place this week. As I understand it, as of yesterday, 557 people from 28 sectors had confirmed. They had made provisions for 1,000 delegates. So I'm looking into some of the information coming out of that particular briefing. I'll update you a little bit more, but I want to stay with that topic. In a short while, I want to speak to Lukhona Mnguni, an analyst, just to make sense of what it's like when the turkey is being asked to vote for its Christmas, when it'll be on the table, because that's actually what this dialogue is in a way. I want to bring on now political analyst Lukhona Mnguni. Lukhona, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'd want to say the essence of the dialogue, from where I understand it, wants to look at what's gone wrong in the country, including the political elite. And it's asking the political elites to have facilitate this thing that will go back and say, you unfit for purpose. That's asking the turkey to participate in the Christmas where the turkey will be on the table and be carved. It wasn't going to work in the long run. Am I wrong?
Well, Tshidi, good morning and good morning to your listeners. I suppose the water is a bit too muddied now. It's almost even impossible to know where to start. And of course, I think the greatest error in this entire process was thinking that you could have government simply financing a process and then walking away from it and handing it over to simply the foundations and civil society without wanting to necessarily be involved in the preparatory task teams and so on. That may well have been an error, and maybe if it was to be an entirely civil society-led, dialogue, it ought to have put up a massive fundraising effort to get the necessary funds from private individuals and entities, so that the control would be clearly rested with organizations outside of government. Once you get government involved and government money involved, you of course invite that mix masala kind of approach. But let's not for a moment forget that to say you want to go to all of society and have a dialogue is a significant political statement and political issue. And therefore, there's always going to be political contestation of the center of power of that kind of process. And that's the unfortunate part here. And I think there was also just a flurry of too much ego and personalities in the room, and at the end of the day, being unable to be controlled and to focus on what the mission and the necessity of the dialogue is. Because whether the fallout of foundations or of some of the foundations with the process will have significant impact in the momentum of the national dialogue, we'll have to see on the 15th of August. But I do think that the 15th of August will most likely be quite an underwhelming event in many ways.
Yeah, a part of me, Lukhona, thinks that what we're headed for is what we've seen. We see Mbizos every other day. It feels to me very much like government will then facilitate what feels like an Mbizo under the name National Dialogue, but it wouldn't be very different. And that's not the intention. And I don't know if you can weigh in on that, along with whether or not South Africans actually need to have a conversation. I've seen the arguments where people say it's too much money, it's a waste of time, that if you tune into any talk radio station, certainly if you listen to us, you hear what the issues are. You hear what South Africans are saying. The people who are in parliament, that some of the foundations, that at least the eminent persons group said to me, they want to hear what South Africans think. They tune in. They know how South Africans feel.
Look, Tshidi, by far and large, I think we all know the issues, to be quite frank. But I think the process of a national dialogue is to try and, get everybody behind some form of process that leads towards an outcome that is somewhat society-wide, led and co-owned. The question is whether or not our society politically is at a moment in history where it can find itself. I think our society is fragmenting into single issues, into regional issues that are by nature not easy to reconcile into one issue. So, for example, if you place the question of foreign nationals and illegal immigrants up on the table, I think we would probably debate many sides until the chickens come home, and there'll be no consensus on that particular issue. And so I think we need to be clear that once then the momentum to gravitate towards the national dialogue dissipates and different people shift and move away from it, it then does create a problem. And of course, so I'm saying there's no problem with the dialogue. There's no problem with going and doing a deep stick to try and form some national consensus on what needs to happen. But I'm not sure if the gatekeepers of the status quo are in the room and are well represented. I'm not sure if people are open to interrogating our reality and go back in time in history in doing that and face some painful truths about what has worked and what has not worked with our democratic dispensation, and whether or not then, which is where the skepticism came with some of the legacy foundations, as to whether or not they would be open to having some of their patrons and people being taken to task and criticized and all of that. So how do you then foster very serious and painful conversations? But I do think that what is probably going to happen come Friday is that you are going to have, yes, maybe an exaggerated, extravagant sort of imbizo, but I think you are also going to have a serious disagreement with process. I mean, I've always been saying, because I've been in conversation with some of the people in the preparatory task team. For example, if you look at the statement now that is being, read out by, I think, Boichoko from Kagiso Trust, it's quite clear. I mean, they're still talking about going to the National Convention to then come up with a steering coordinating committee for the national dialogue process. But the president has put the eminent persons group there. There's an entire preparatory task team. And I said, if you go to a national convention and you are trying to elect steering committees, you're going to collapse that thing into a power contestation and who becomes in and who becomes out. And you are going to probably divide and fragment civil society. And we've seen this in a number of processes where voting becomes now part of the problem of trying to set up these organizations. I mean, Defend Our Democracy went through that route and they've not really recovered from it. Unmute Civil Society went through that route, which was organized by the Trust. They've not recovered from it. So if you go to a national convention and you create room for power contestations, you probably collapse the process before it even begins because you contaminate it with politics rather than with substance.
In a sentence, really, how do they remedy this? Are there fixes? Can it be fixed?
I think it can be fixed. The president, in the first instance, must open up room to ask some of the elders in our society who are respected and trailblazing young people who are respected to come into the room and share some ideas. I think there's a need of reconfiguring entirely the setup and the multiple, bondokis of power that have been created in this. You need a central coordinating structure that's going to have clear power and authority over this process. And maybe it may well be that the presidency says, no, we've sponsored the national convention, you can kick off, go fundraise, mobilize the private sector, get funding. You do need to get independent funding from government if this process is going to be citizens-led and not government-led. Because you can't have the same government, which people are very tired of, by the way, trying to get them into conversation. They don't really want to interact with government at this stage. So
yeah,
that's the real difficulty here, Tshidi.
All right, thank you so much. That's Lukhona Mnguni weighing in there on the national dialogue and warning really against the politicization of the entire process and how damning it could be. I still vacillate whether or not we need it or not. My take is South Africans do want to talk to one another. They want to find a way forward. I think they're aggrieved by government's involvement. It's a little bit after past.
Hanging out with Clement
on 702.
Let's walk the talk.